Karen had done a lot of crazy things over the years, but this was next-level insanity. Welcome to Logan's Stories. Before we begin, drop a like on the video and subscribe so we can continue making videos like this one. It all started when I woke up to the sound of screeching tires and metal chains clanking outside my window. I groggily pulled myself out of bed, thinking it was just another garbage pickup day. But when I stepped outside, my car was gone. Not just mine. Half the street was empty. I turned just in time to see another tow truck hooking up my neighbor's sedan, the flashing orange lights cutting through the early morning mist. People were running outside in their pajamas, shouting and demanding answers, but the drivers didn't even acknowledge them. And there, standing smugly on the sidewalk, was Karen, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, watching the chaos unfold like she had personally orchestrated it. I stormed up to her. "Karen, what the hell is going on?" She barely glanced at me, just gave me that usual self-satisfied smirk. "Good morning, just a little community cleanup initiative. Some of you have been violating the new overnight parking restrictions and we simply can't have that." My jaw clenched. Overnight parking restrictions? That was never a rule. She tilted her head dramatically, tapping her clipboard. "It was passed in an emergency HOA board meeting last night. We determined that cars parked overnight outside of driveways ruin the neighborhood's aesthetic, so we enforced it immediately." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "Karen, you can't just tow people's cars without notice. That's illegal." She grinned. "Actually, it's not. All residents signed an agreement stating they would comply with all HOA regulations, including new ones enacted to maintain community standards. You agreed to this the day you bought your home." I wanted to strangle her. Across the street, my elderly neighbor, Mr. Peterson, was nearly in tears, watching the tow truck drag away his 1965 Classic Mustang, a car he had restored with his late son. Another neighbor, the Rodriguezes, were frantically calling the towing company, demanding answers. "Where are they taking our cars?" someone shouted. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, as if all this drama was inconveniencing her. "The company I contracted is taking them to an impound lot 2 towns over. You can retrieve them after paying the necessary fees, which, by the way, have been pre-approved by the HOA." "You're extorting people," I snapped. "This is theft." She laughed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. This is simply community enforcement. If people can't follow the rules, they face the consequences." That's when a voice cut through the crowd. "Where's my car?" The street fell dead silent. Karen's smirk faltered just a little as we all turned to see a man in an expensive navy suit standing near the curb, arms folded. His face? Pure fury. I'd never seen him before, but something about the way Karen suddenly stiffened told me she knew exactly who he was. "And you are?" Karen asked, trying to regain her composure. The man stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. "I'm David Lawson, the district attorney of this county," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "And my car was just towed." Karen blinked. For the first time ever, she looked genuinely nervous. The entire street was dead silent, everyone watching with wide eyes as realization dawned on Karen's face. "Mr. Lawson," she started, forcing a tight smile, "I assure you this is just a standard HOA matter." "I don't think so," he interrupted, pulling out his phone, "because what you just did violates multiple state laws." Karen's face drained of color. "You enacted a rule overnight with no notice, no public record, and no approval from the county? Then you had a private towing company illegally remove personal property from public access roads?" Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "You're looking at civil liability, criminal charges, and a full-scale investigation into how this HOA has been operating," Lawson continued, completely unshaken. "And since my vehicle is county property, you may have just committed a felony." Karen staggered back. I was just enforcing community standards." "Community standards don't override the law," he snapped. "And if you think you can just rewrite rules to scam homeowners, you're in for a very rude awakening." Karen's composure was shattering by the second. The neighborhood, once terrified of her, was starting to smile. People were whispering, others pulling out their phones to record. "So, here's what's going to happen," the DA continued, stepping closer. You are going to call the towing company and have every single car returned immediately, at HOA expense. You are going to personally issue a statement admitting fault. And then, his eyes narrowed, you're going to prepare for a legal battle. Karen physically trembled. I could tell she wanted to argue, but for the first time in her life, she had no way out. In one morning, she had towed the car of the district attorney, committed multiple legal violations, put the entire HOA under a criminal investigation, and destroyed whatever power she thought she had. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The weight of her mistake was finally sinking in, but Karen wasn't about to go down quietly. Instead of accepting responsibility, she did what she always did, doubled down and made things even worse. By the time David Lawson finished laying out every single law she had broken, Karen's face had gone from smug superiority to barely concealed panic. But rather than admitting defeat, she crossed her arms and tried to play the victim. "This is a private community matter," she snapped. "We have every right to enforce our parking policies. If people can't follow the rules, that's not my fault." Lawson didn't even blink. "You can enforce policies, but you can't break state law in the process, and you definitely can't tow government property." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "If that's true, then file a complaint with the HOA. I'll make sure it's reviewed properly." I had to stop myself from laughing. The sheer delusion was astounding. Lawson raised an eyebrow. "You think I need to go through the HOA? I don't think you understand how serious this is. You illegally towed my car, a county-owned vehicle. That's felony theft." Karen's smirk faltered. "It was not theft. The car was in violation. The car was parked legally in front of my own house." Lawson cut in, his voice dangerously calm. "And yet it was towed without warning, without cause, and without the proper legal authorization. That's not enforcement. That's a crime." At that moment, Karen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and I saw her face turn completely white. Without another word, she turned and sprinted toward her house. Lawson and I exchanged a look before following, along with half the neighborhood, as she shoved open her front door and rushed inside. The rest of us didn't have to wait long to find out what she was looking at. Seconds later, sirens filled the air. 2 police cruisers rolled up to Karen's house, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, looking as serious as death. Karen re-emerged onto her porch, her hands shaking. What's the meaning of this?" One of the officers approached, glancing at a document in his hand. "Are you Karen Davis?" She hesitated. I am, but You're under investigation for illegal towing practices, misuse of public property, and fraudulent impound fees," he said flatly. "We need to ask you a few questions." Karen staggered back, looking around frantically for someone to save her, but for once, no one came to her defense. Instead, the entire neighborhood watched. Karen spent the next hour arguing, lying, and digging herself into an even deeper hole. She claimed the board had approved everything. The officers checked, there were no records of the new parking rule. She claimed she had warned residents ahead of time. That was also a lie. Not a single warning had been issued. She even tried to say that the towing company had acted on its own, but when officers pulled the contract from her emails, they saw her signature authorizing the removals. Lawson watched it all with his arms crossed, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Karen turned on him, eyes burning with fury. "You did this! This is a setup! You set yourself up!" he shot back. "All I did was park my car legally and watch you dig your own grave." That's when the final nail in the coffin arrived. Another police cruiser pulled up and out stepped a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. He adjusted his tie and walked straight up to Karen. "Miss Davis, I'm a representative of the state's Department of Consumer Affairs. We received multiple complaints regarding fraudulent towing and illegal impound practices in this community. I'm here to conduct a full investigation." Karen froze. The officer beside him nodded. "Ms. Davis, at this time, we're going to ask you to come down to the station for further questioning." Karen stumbled back. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I was just—" "Ma'am, if you refuse to cooperate, we'll have to take you in by force." The entire neighborhood held their breath. And then, for the first time ever, Karen shut up, because she knew. She was done. As she was led toward the police car, the whispers in the crowd turned to murmurs, then to laughter. People actually cheered. The woman who had terrorized this neighborhood for years was finally facing consequences. Lawson let out a small chuckle beside me. "Well, that escalated quickly," I smirked. "You're not wrong. You ever think about running for HOA president?" he asked, giving me a side glance. I laughed. "Oh, absolutely not," Lawson grinned. "Smart man." As Karen was loaded into the back seat of the cruiser, her face was red with rage, but there was nothing she could do. The cops drove off, taking her straight to the station, and for the first time in a long, long time, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Karen's arrest should have been the end of it, but as it turned out, she had a lot more to answer for than just illegal towing. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the local press had picked up the story. Disgraced HOA president arrested for fraudulent towing scheme. The headline was plastered across every local news site, with pictures of Karen being led into the police station in handcuffs circulating online. Neighbors couldn't stop talking about it. At the local coffee shop, the grocery store, even at the dog park, people were buzzing about Karen's downfall. The HOA board members, the same ones who had always backed her up, were now scrambling to distance themselves. One of them, a guy named Todd, went on record saying, "We had no idea she was conducting business this way. If we had known, we would have intervened sooner." It was absolute nonsense, of course. Todd had signed off on half of her ridiculous policies, but now that Karen was officially a liability, he and the rest of the board were doing everything they could to make it seem like they had been just as blindsided as the rest of us. But the worst part for Karen? The investigation was far from over. By the next morning, a full audit of the HOA's finances was underway. Lawson, being both the victim and the district attorney, wasted no time in filing criminal charges. The fraudulent towing alone carried multiple counts of theft, but the deeper they dug, the worse it got. Turns out, Karen had been running an entire scam behind the scenes. She had been charging homeowners extra fees that weren't actually required by the HOA. The money? Funneled straight into a personal slush fund. We weren't just talking about a few $100s here and there. Karen had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars over the years, using it to fund vacations, luxury purchases, and home renovations. When investigators pulled the receipts, it was damning. Karen's house, which she had always claimed to have paid for out of pocket, had multiple HOA checks traced directly to the renovations. She had been using community funds to pay for everything. Karen's charges tripled overnight. By the time her arraignment came around, she was facing felony charges for fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of funds, in addition to her towing violations. Her lawyer tried to argue for bail, but given the sheer number of charges and the possibility of her fleeing the state, the judge denied it. Karen lost it in the courtroom. She screamed at the judge, calling the case a witch hunt and blaming the entire thing on jealous, petty neighbors who didn't respect authority. It didn't work. She was sent straight back to jail. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the fallout from Karen's reign continued to unravel. With her out of power, the remaining board members were left to answer for everything. Todd, the spineless board member, resigned immediately. So did two others. The remaining members, desperate to avoid legal trouble, started doing everything they could to appease the community. HOA fines? Suspended. The new parking rule? Completely revoked. All of the illegally towed cars were returned at HOA expense, just as Lawson had demanded. And then came the community vote. For the first time in years, the entire neighborhood came together to elect a new board, one that actually cared about the residents instead of abusing them for power. Karen's entire regime was officially over. Months later, her trial finally began. By then, she was completely ruined. Her house had been seized to pay restitution to the homeowners she had scammed. Her personal accounts were frozen. She had lost everything. The trial itself was a disaster for her. The evidence was too overwhelming. Every fraudulent check, every shady business deal, every single scam she had pulled was exposed in front of a full courtroom. The jury took less than 4 hours to deliberate. Karen was found guilty on all counts. The judge, making an example out of her, sentenced her to 8 years in prison. 3 for fraud, 5 for theft and abuse of power. She collapsed in her chair, sobbing as the verdict was read. But no one had sympathy for her. And as for the neighborhood, it had never been better. Without Karen around to terrorize homeowners, people actually enjoyed living there. Lawson, who had become a bit of a legend after the whole ordeal, even helped implement new regulations that kept the HOA from ever pulling something like this again. One evening, as I sat on my newly unrestricted front porch, watching my neighbor repaint their house whatever color they wanted, Lawson walked by and gave me a nod. "Guess it all worked out," he said. I grinned. "Yeah, and the best part?" He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" I glanced over at Karen's now foreclosed house, its windows boarded up, a for sale sign stuck in the lawn. "She doesn't get to come back. Ever." Lawson smirked. Justice served, and for the first time in years, our neighborhood was finally free.